a politically charged term that contains a racial subtext of Muslim domestic terrorist. And it facilitates the selective enforcement of counterterrorism laws against Muslims. Now, while preventing domestic terrorism is a legitimate public safety concern that affects all of us residing in the United States, the current debate is misguidedly focused on terrorism committed by Muslims, while non-Muslims engage in terrorist activities undetected because they do not fit ineffective racial or religious profiles. So as law enforcement struggles to prevent the next attack on U.S. soil, it adopts essentialist definitions of Muslims as prone to terrorism, which thereby stigmatizes more than 6 million Americans because of the illegal acts of a handful of Muslims. And all of this goes against the fundamental American principle of holding individuals responsible for their acts, not the acts of others. And what rarely is discussed is the fact that there are many Muslims who in fact participated in countering recent terrorist activities. And many of us in the room know that, for example, with the attempted terrorist plot of Faiz al-Shahzad in New York City, it was a Senegalese Muslim who was the first to report the smoke coming out of the truck. Similarly, with the Nigerian bomber, Nigerian attempted bomber, on December 25, 2009, it was his father, who was a Muslim, who reported him to the U.S. Embassy because he was concerned that he had serious mental health issues. So these types of efforts are completely overlooked, while what's being focused on in the rhetoric is specific individuals, which I would certainly call bad actors and bad apples, as representing 6 million people in the United States and 1 billion people abroad. And as Reem Salahi had mentioned recently, this discourse is not limited to the homegrown terrorism aspect, or say the adverse consequences. It starts to then reinforce the stereotypes within the public, and then contributes to discrimination in various contexts. So, for example, I recently published an article in the New York City Law Review called Sticks and Stones, the Words That Hurt, and it documents very thoroughly how these stereotypes have permeated into the workplace and caused very palpable and very serious employment discrimination. And I think we all know that when your livelihood is threatened and you're being terminated or you're not being hired, you have a very hard time being involved in civic activities and surviving. And another way that these stereotypes have played out is, for example, in December 2010, just last month, there were at least 3 reported cases of racial violence against Muslims who wore the headscarf. These are random acts of violence that occurred while the perpetrator was expressing racial slurs, anti-Muslim slurs. So there are very real and serious repercussions of this type of irresponsible discourse that Representative King, being one example, is participating in. And one thing I just want to point out, particularly for those who are not Muslim in the audience, is that Representative King is claiming that the reason he wants to have these holdings is because he believes that the Muslim community, particularly Muslim leaders, have not been cooperative in combating terrorism. And that's despite hundreds of press releases and hundreds of notes, or I should say comments by Muslim leaders condemning terrorism ad nauseum almost. But the concern for all of us is, do we want government deputizing religious leaders to do the work of the FBI and the police? Do we want priests going and telling the police and the FBI what their congregants tell them during confession? Do we want preachers who have congregants who are white supremacists, who engage in violence based on their Christian beliefs, going and spying on their congregation, looking for criminal activity that they don't have direct knowledge of, but just by virtue of everyone being Christian and being their congregation, they may be guilty? So I think as a public policy matter, we really need to think about the broad implications of what Representative King is calling for.
Professor Aziz, I know I'm going to get the book from our organizer, and since Representative King is from New York, and upstate New York, I think, I thought that might...
Long Island.
Oh, from Long Island. Well, you're still stuck with them in your state. And I thought that might be an interesting transition to Steve Downs' testimony. And I suspect we may be able to go over our time a little bit because we started late. But we can ask you both questions, I think, when the testimony is finished, because I think we have...
Yes.
Is that workable? Yeah.
And I actually was done, but
Yeah,
I wanted to just close because this is an important point that I wanted to make. Is I just want to end my comments today in solidarity with the people of Egypt. Because I speak as a proud American with a heavy heart, as I witness the heavy price that the people of Egypt have to pay to demand democracy and freedom. And I want to note that we are all very privileged to be in a country where we can sit here and openly criticize our government's practices without being beaten in the streets, hauled off to a torture chamber, or executed without due process or rights. And I think this is a point for us to emphasize because it is for the dissenters, the critics, and the unpopular minorities that our founding fathers sought to protect when they drafted our Constitution. And I'm very proud to be here today defending those rights for all Americans. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.